should I sit?
Oh, no. If you want to be, yeah, I think it's better if I sit.
Okay.
Well, good evening, everybody. Good evening, especially Professor Augustus Bonner Cochran III, which is, I must say initially that it's a great honor and a pleasure for us from the University of São Paulo School of Law to receive you here, to have you joining us this afternoon. We are increasingly very interested in the North American labor relations, and it is on account is derives from the changes of our labor law and changing towards increasing role of courts in establishing rules and ruling and regulating labor relations and collective relations. So it's very good. It's a delightful opportunity to have you with us. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. You're welcome. Professor, just a couple of words. Professor, as Professor Gus, or simply Gus, he's on the AGNES College of Georgia, and most recently in a stay as a visiting professor at the University of Santa Catarina, Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina, as a visiting fellow. But it's not the first time he comes to Brazil. We already know that he's very interested in Brazil. We don't know exactly why so interested in Brazil, but it's an honor to have a so prestigious scholar interested in our country, in our legal experience. So once more, thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. It's a real pleasure to be here and an honor to be at USP, and I want to thank particularly Professor FREITAS for the invitation. I will now clear up the mystery of why I'm interested in Brazil. I was an exchange student in Itu before it was big in 1963. So, in fact, it looks like I arrived in Brazil before you did. But I was not able to come back for 40 years. I forgot most of my Portuguese, and since 2001, I returned for the first time, and I remembered how much I adore Brazil. And so now, every year I try to come and I try to study Portuguese, but it's good that it's in English because my Portuguese is bad grammar and even worse pronunciation. I think you might be able to perceive that even my English is a sort of odd pronunciation because I'm from the south of the United States, and I have a very thick accent. I'm from Atlanta, the city of Gone with the Wind, or Ray Charles, or for your generation, The Walking Dead is filmed in Atlanta. So this is my faculdade. It's an interesting place because, for one thing, it's very beautiful in the fall when we have leaves changing. It's very small, less than 1,000 students, but maybe what's most interesting to you is that all the students are women. This is a style of education that is fairly old and traditional and now a little bit ultrapassado, I think. There are only something like 30 women's colleges left in the country. And I think we survive partly because we are in Atlanta, where Coca-Cola, actually a suburb of Atlanta, where Coca-Cola was invented. And the family that was the first owner of Coca-Cola lived right across the street from this college, and they sent their daughters to the college, and they've given us much endowment, you would say patrocinio. So I encourage all of you to drink Coca-Cola so that I can have a job, But not in plastic bottles, please. It's a terrible, terrible thing. I'm a political scientist, and this is not a law school. It's a liberal arts, very general style of small college. But I have a law degree also, and I've worked part-time as a lawyer. So I'm interested in the intersection of law and the sort of larger political and social trends. And so tonight I'm going to try to talk very broadly about this problem of gig employees and the misclassification of employees, but not so much specific and technical as to try to set it in a larger setting. And I have to make one more apology before I begin. About 2 months ago, I had a problem with sinus, a cold, and I'm well now, but my ears are still fechado. I am having real trouble hearing, so if you have commentary or questions, you may have to yell at me. I will not take it personally, but it's necessary for me to hear. So I have really 3 big lectures, and so actually after maybe 45 minutes, somebody should raise their hand and say, you need to bring this to a close, because it's a broad set of topics. First, I would like to talk about who is an employee and how the U.S. labor and employment law deals with that issue. Second, I would like to put it in the context of some political economy and the way the models of capitalism change. I'll do less on that, but to some extent I'll talk some about neoliberalism. Maybe Americans in the U.S. need to hear more about neoliberalism than you do, because I think people in Latin America seem to have a better conception of what that means and how that affects things. But I'd like to talk about different ways of understanding that. And then last, my own personal interest as a political scientist is in democratic theory. And I think that there are more democratic alternatives than the way our current society is organized. And I would talk some about that if we have time for that. So I'll begin with a test of your eyesight. This is a very old painting, 1733, by John Heaton. A very fine law professor, Catherine Stone, begins her book on labor law in the U.S. talking about this painting. And what's interesting about this painting, it's actually one long, but it's too long. It won't fit on a screen. It's one long mural. But it portrays a number of people working in different ways. And her point is, even though they're all workers, none of them would be considered in the eyes of the law employees. So, for instance, there were slaves. There are indentured servants. There are craft workers. There are merchants. There are apprentices. There's even the farm owner and his wife. They would have worked, and probably the kids would have worked, because much of the production was in the home in that era. And in fact, in 1800, only about 20% of American workers were employees. During the 19th century, workers became freer. We abolished indentured servitude. We abolished slavery, for example. But at the same time, they became less independent. Many workers on small farms or in craft shops had to move to the cities often and become employees in offices or factories. And so by 1900, about 50% of American workers were employees. And I'm a little ahead of myself. And now I think probably about 90% of our workers are considered employees. But given recent trends, especially in the gig economy, it makes you wonder whether fewer and fewer Americans are now going to be considered employees. In fact, we may be moving from an economy of free employees to an economy free of employees. And so that's what we might consider tonight. So I'll start very broadly with a background of American law and how it treats the whole employment relation. And so traditionally, American common law was, although it had some statutes back in 1349, for example, but English law of employment was master-servant law. And this approach to employment considered employment like a status, almost like marriage, where you're in a certain role. Both parties in these roles have benefits, both have duties to the other. For example, masters were bound to care for their servants if they were sick or injured, but servants were bound to obey their masters. They owed them loyalty and obedience. And the normal work contract was considered to be 1 year. Why a year? Well, in an agrarian society, there are periods when there's very little work, and so it's very favorable to the employees. Other periods where the work is very hard, very favorable to the employer, and he's getting a lot for his money. And so it sort of balances things out. And if the worker left the employment before the year was over, there were very severe consequences. In England, an employee that left before the year could be put in jail until he agreed to return to work. In America, we were never quite that harsh, but it was not uncommon for workers to lose their pay, including for the work they had already done, if they left before a year. But at the end of the 19th century, courts began to consider work employment more as a contract and not as a status. And so we began to change the law. This was not done by statute. This was done by judicial interpretations, this sort of classic common law made by judges in the process of adjudicating cases. And so, beginning with particularly a treatise written by this Horace Ward, judges began to say that if a contract for employment did not contain an explicit term, an explicit date for how long it would last, that the courts would consider them to be at-will contracts. At-will is a sort of difficult concept to explain, but it really means that either party can terminate the contract at any moment and for any reason. As maybe the most famous definition ever of at-will employment was stated by a court, it's that the employer may fire or discharge the employee for just cause, but also for unjust cause, or for no cause whatsoever. And so this produced more freedom for the employee because they too could leave at any moment, but it also produced great insecurity, as you can imagine. And given the sort of imbalance in the employment relationship, this really means that the employers have great power and most of the discretion is in their hands. So Karl Polanyi, I think, captured to some extent the problem here and what happened as a result of this problem. Polanyi, as probably you know, believed that all societies have had markets, but that market society, that is an economy where the market is largely unregulated, has never existed. And in fact, the idea of that is a sort of utopian ideal because it cannot exist. And mostly it cannot exist because of what he called fictitious commodities, that labor, land or nature, money, these are not commodities in the sense that they can just be bought and sold and not produced from the market. So, for instance, labor in particular, labor is not just a commodity, it's human beings, and they have needs and they have rights. And so he anticipated that there would be what he called a double movement. That first there was a movement by the sort of liberal ideology to create a free market. For instance, the at-will employment is a free labor market. But that secondly, there would be a second movement to provide rights to protect labor, which is really workers and human beings. And that's exactly what we saw in the United States. First in the 19th century, the at-will doctrine coming from common law and the courts. And then 3 great waves of legislation, mostly, to try to protect workers a bit. So in the 30s, for example, our 2 big labor laws were done by Franklin Roosevelt in the New Deal. The National Labor Relations Act protects the right to organize, to syndicalize, and bargain collectively. And the Fair Labor Standards Act sets a minimum wage and maximum hours or overtime. Then during the 60s, at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And one part of that act was Title VII, or Capitula Secchi, and this forbade discrimination, but only certain types of discrimination. Discrimination based on race, color, religion, national origin, and at the last minute they added sex. And since then there have been a few other laws to ban other kinds of discrimination, such as age or disability. But actually very few types of discrimination are illegal, at least under national law in the U.S. For example, it is not now clearly illegal to discharge someone or discriminate against someone in their employment because of their sexual orientation. The Supreme Court will decide in interpreting whether discrimination because of sex includes sexual orientation or not. In fact, that's where we've just been talking in an interview about sexual harassment. There is no statute nationally against sexual harassment. It was an interpretation of the Supreme Court that sexual harassment was a type of discrimination on the basis of sex that made it illegal. And then in the 1970s and 80s, we've had a few more miscellaneous laws like health and safety at work, protecting pensions, and that sort of thing. But generally, this is then the framework. I have another test of your eyesight here. Sorry about the complexity of this chart, but what I'm trying to say here is that if you think of this as sort of the set of all the decisions that employers can make, they have virtually unlimited discretion. So here, they can fire people for good reason, bad reason, no reason whatsoever. They just can't break a contract. It can be an individual contract. Virtually no one has an explicit individual contract that's not at will. Or it could be a collective contract through a union. But today, contrary to the popular image, only 6% of private workers are unionized in the U.S. So unionization is really in bad shape in the United States. Or they can't fire you. They can fire you for a bad reason, an immoral reason, a crazy reason, but they cannot violate a statute. So over here, I'm sorry, I hit the wrong thing. So they can't discriminate against you because of your race or sex. They cannot fire you because you tried to organize a union. A few things like that. But on the whole, they have the discretion. For example, a woman in the 2000 election put a John Kerry bumper sticker on her car. Her boss, like George Bush, she parked her car in the parking lot, never spoke a word of politics inside the office, but her boss found out she had a bumper sticker for Kerry and he fired her. We have examples of people being fired for wearing the wrong football jersey to work if your boss likes the other team. There's even a famous case where someone was fired, Coca-Cola fired somebody for drinking Pepsi. And of course, I think they should have been, but no, it's sad. So this is the framework, this common law at-will doctrine is the default. Unless there's a contract, unless there's a law, you have basically no rights because your boss just says, I'm tired of this relationship. I'm bored. It's over. So this is sort of the background. Even though we don't have many rights, what rights we have as workers, generally depend on being defined as an employee, not as an independent worker, in which case you just have contract rights under the civil law. So it's important to know then who is an employee. And in fact, sometimes I think we are, to follow Polanyi, in a kind of third movement in the 21st century where we're going back to a more liberal market of everybody's an independent contract meeting in a labor market with no rights. So each, to just really complicate things, every statute has its own definition of who an employee is. And as you can see, I've quoted the sort of essence of many of these definitions. They're very vague, they're very common sense, and to tell you the truth, they're not very helpful. They're tautological. My favorite is Title VII. The term employee means an individual who is employed by an employer. Wow. Muito obrigado. That just clears up everything, doesn't it? So, Catherine Stone and other writers think maybe this didn't matter so much back in the 1930s when many of these laws were written, because there was a sort of assumption of a standard pattern of employment. It was pretty clear who was an employee because you went to work for General Motors and you got promoted and you stayed there probably your whole life. You worked 8 to 5, you worked 40 hours a week. It's just fairly standard. Nowadays, we have a lot of terms for it, but maybe contingent or non-standard kind of work is increasingly common. Again, I read a lot of statistics, and I'm not sure how good the statistics are. There's a lot of controversy about how much employment is contingent, but maybe a couple of decades ago it was 10%. People estimate that now it may be as high as 1/3, and that within a few years it may be as high as 50%. Again, I've read figures much lower than that, but that's the sort of scary picture of employment. So it really does make a difference. And of course, maybe the one that's getting the most attention, it's not the only form of contingent employment by any means, but the form that gets most attention is platform employment, or, you know, we have a lot of terms, gig or on demand, sharing economy, TaskRabbit, etc. I don't think I should talk much about this. Again, I will say that, you know, the estimates of how extensive this is, there's a lot of argument. This is not the most recent statistic, but just to pick Uber as maybe the most well-known, it recently was valued at $65 billion with over 600,000 drivers in 195 North American cities and 68 countries. So one law professor calls it Uber capitalism, and that's a sort of pun using German Uber for over. And of course, the mystery is, how can Uber have over 500,000 drivers and say they have no employees? But of course, Uber says we're a technology company. We're not a transportation company. So that's what's going on. A lot of people love platform companies and the platform economy. I think I saw the expression, they have platform fever. They're so hot for the changes that this is bringing. And I think there's no doubt, I'm taking Uber here, my conscience hurts me because I don't see how these drivers can survive at the prices that I'm paying, especially with the exchange rate is what it is. But even in the U.S., it's not a good living. I might talk about it later, but I think some studies argue that Uber drivers really make about $9 or $10 an hour once you take in the U.S., once you take into account the real cost to them. I can't imagine what it is here. It must be nothing. On the other hand, obviously, many people see many problems with Uber and find it to bring a lot of social problems, particularly with employment. I think there's a lot of controversy. The enthusiasts say that gig work promotes independence, choice, autonomy, freedom, mobilizing unused resources, wealth of untapped advantages, and TaskRabbit. Do you have TaskRabbit here? Yeah, their slogan apparently is empowering people to do what they love, which would be a good thing, but it's pretty far from the reality, I expect. The critics, on the other hand, say that gig workers are being misclassified, that they really are employees, and that their wages are being stolen, they're underpaid, they're overworked, they're exploited, and they're constantly being monitored like a panopticon. One judge apparently actually quoted Foucault, of all things. Maybe that's not so unusual here, where I think law school is a good deal more philosophical, but for us to have a judge quote a French philosopher is quite interesting. And I might add, even far from subverting monopoly, there's a fair amount of evidence that these companies are, in fact, reestablishing monopolies. Over half the business in each platform industry is done by the dominant company, and at least in the U.S., Uber controls 85% of ride sharing. So the idea that these are rebel, kind of anti-establishment companies is a bit of an image. So, are these gig employees, or excuse me, gig workers, are they employees or are they, in fact, independent contractors? Given that the statutes don't help, judges have to fill in the gap with various tests or criteria to help them make a determination in each case, looking at the facts based on assessing them on certain kinds of criteria. Common sense, incidentally, I was going to mention that to some extent the British may be using more common sense than we are. A British judge said the idea that Uber is a mosaic of 30,000 independent businesses in London alone, he said it's fairly ridiculous on the face of it. He also said the idea that Uber is a technology company, just a broker of services and not a provider of services, is also a bit ridiculous. He says Uber is no more a technology company than the Yellow Cab company is a technology company just because it uses CB radios to dispatch taxi cabs. But law doesn't rely on common sense. In fact, a famous American Supreme Court judge once said the law is an ass, burro, so they need more precise tests. So traditionally, the common law used this kind of a test that is a multi-factor test to primarily determine who controls the work, not just the ends of the work, but the means of the work, who provides the tools, how is the worker paid, who sets the hours, who sets the means of payment, all this sort of thing. And so there are multiple factors, 8 primary factors, 5 additional factors, and then even a few more factors. And part of the problem is no one factor has primacy. So you can imagine when you come to a judge and you bring some complicated facts and they use all these criteria, the decision can go anywhere. It depends so much on the subjective ideas of the judge. And so it makes the law very inconsistent and very unpredictable, which the law doesn't like, obviously. And so some agencies, for instance, the Labor Department, has sort of modified this, in particular to make it more realistic by considering the economic realities, to say, is the worker dependent on the person he's doing the work for? So if you're a painter and I hire you to come paint my house, you're not really dependent on me because you're going to paint my house in 2 days and then you're going to go somewhere else and paint somebody else's house. You're pretty independent. But if you're a full-time Uber driver, sure, you might pick up a few extra dollars driving for Lyft, or you might work part-time somewhere else to supplement your income. But you're pretty much dependent for your livelihood on this primary employer. So that's a second kind of test. And then here's a third test. And I should have said, not only are the tests complicated, but notice there's a choice of tests, and judges get to decide which test they want to choose. And so some reformers prefer this called ABC test. And incidentally, I can leave this slide presentation with Professor Freitas if you want me to, and you can see all this in a little more detail. But this is, as you can tell, a simpler test, and yet in some ways a more realistic test. It looks at who controls the work, but then it also asks, is the work being done outside the usual course of business, the business services offered by the company? Like is Uber a technology company that's developing television and computers, or is it just providing rides? That would be a factor that would be hard for Uber to overcome. And it also asks, is the worker principally engaged in this occupation? So if it's a Uber worker who sort of does this on the side as a contract job, then yes, he's an independent worker. But if she really is driving almost full time for Uber, it's sort of hard. What's I think more important in this test is that it begins with a presumption that the worker is an employee, and the burden of proof is on the employer to show that the worker is not, and therefore an independent contractor. So under this test, the reason reformers like it is under this test, you're much more likely to have workers classified as employees than under the other test. So why does any of this matter? Again, there are not a lot of labor rights in the U.S., but what there are depends on being considered an employee. So, for instance, the right to organize a union is completely dependent on being an employee. Independent contractors actually might be violating restraint of trade or monopolization kind of laws. Some of the wage hour minimums, etc. The benefits, unemployment insurance, worker compensation, family and health leave kind of benefits depend on your being classed as an employee. What about taxes? For most employees, your employer matches your payroll taxes, but if you're an independent independent worker, you have to pay these taxes yourself. And maybe the most interesting for Uber drivers is what happens if you're in a wreck and your passenger is injured? Do they sue Uber or do they sue the driver? And if Uber is not the employer, Uber is sort of off the hook. So there are huge stakes both for the workers and for these companies. One estimate, again, all these statistics I think should be taken with a grain of salt. But one estimate I read said that employment savings by not having to pay these costs for Uber are something like 25% of its profits. So, and that Uber would owe its drivers about $1 billion if they were classified as employees rather than independent. So what should we do? We were talking on the way over here about various solutions, but this is from a professor, a really outstanding law professor of employment law named Orly LaBelle. And she says there are four basic options in her view. One, we can improve and clarify the definition so that we sort of know once and for all this kind of worker is and that kind of worker isn't an employee. Second, we could just extend the benefits of employees to all workers and say everybody who works in labor should have the benefit of being able to unionize and have some retirement benefits, etc. The particular solution we were talking about is some people advocate a third category. Uber drivers are not employees in the same way other employees are. They're not, on the other hand, independent contractors like plumbers are or painters are. There's something in between, and we could say this in-between category has some benefits and some rights, but not all the rights of employees. And then maybe the most interesting, she argues in the long run, I don't know whether this is well known, but in the United States, we have a very underdeveloped welfare state, not like Western Europe. And many of the sort of welfare benefits, such as health insurance, comes not for everybody. It's not universal, but you get it through your employer. So, for instance, I have a health insurance plan because I work for Agnes Scott College, and that makes whether or not I'm an employee of Agnes Scott totally important. And she says this would not be such an important question if we had social rights as opposed to simply employment rights. This is way too complicated, I'm sorry, and I just added it, but it's a little more up to date. In that, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of what's going on right now, because it's pretty interesting. So, again, this matters particularly on the issue of the National Labor Relations Act, whether or not you can bargain collectively and organize a union. And so, a kind of anti-union reform in 1947, after the law was passed as a very pro-union law, the Republicans became the majority after World War II and excluded independent contractors. The Supreme Court then adopted that common law, very complicated test as to who is an independent contractor, who is an employee. And then in 2014, in a FedEx, a delivery company case, the Obama National Labor Relations Board, this is the agency that administers this particular law, applied the common law test. The Labor Board doesn't enforce, it's not a judicial body, it cannot enforce its own decisions, so it has to, if the employer resists following the decision, obeying the decision, they have to sue in court and have a federal court order the employer to follow their decision. So the D.C. Circuit, which is the most important of our appeals courts, began in the 2000s to decide that they didn't like this control test, that's the traditional test. They said the issue is one of entrepreneurial opportunities. This precise wording is, hit the wrong button. So the test, or the criteria, whether the position presents the opportunities and risk of entrepreneurship or not. If it presents entrepreneurial opportunities, then you're an independent contractor. If not, you're an employee. So here's where we are today. Just this year, in a decision called Super Shuttle, the Trump National, again, these are political appointees. They tend to change when the president changes, and our labor law looks like a very rough sea with waves of changes depending on whether you have a Republican or Democratic president. So the Trump board has adopted this entrepreneurial opportunities test for deciding. And then even more important, just this April, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board, he's like a procurador, I think. He acts as a prosecutor. He brings cases to the board to decide. He issued what's called an advice memo. It is a directive to all the administrative offices of this labor board. There are 23, 26 around the country. And he basically said, use this entrepreneurial opportunities test, and if you do, Uber drivers are not employees. They are independent contracts. And this is really important because a worker or an employee cannot just go to the Policy Institute. It's a sort of left or liberal think tank. But they did an analysis of this advice memo, and they said not only don't they like the law, they don't like the test of entrepreneurship, but basically they argue that it doesn't fit the facts. In other words, Uber drivers really don't have control over things that a real entrepreneur is able to control, such as the prices, the fares, such as who your customers are, what route you take. So your services in some ways are very limited. You can't build an independent customer base, as I sometimes try to do with Uber drivers, and let's just make a relationship outside and cut Uber out. Even tipping is capped. There is, the argument is Uber drivers are not managed. There's no manager riding along with you, but there's an algorithm that is designed to control your behavior. Interestingly enough, the general counsel said, well, they're entrepreneurs because they don't enjoy employee benefits, things like health care or retirement benefits. And the truth is, something like a third of American workers don't enjoy, employees don't enjoy health benefits, and something like half don't have any retirement benefits. So that hardly cuts them out of the crowd. So the result is low pay and, of course, high turnover. One thing that's really ironic, the general counsel said, well, they're entrepreneurs because they can quit and work for some other transportation service like Lyft, or they can go into some other venture like an investor. If you don't like investing in agriculture, you can invest in steel. The truth is, though, that's true of everybody. It's a free labor system. I can quit in an at-will. I can try to change my occupation, etc. But I think I've already talked about this. What this means, though, is Uber drivers probably have not much of a legal claim under the national law. Now, what's happening that I know your professor is very interested in, and I think people are very interested in here, is California is doing some other things that are very interesting. They had a traditional control test, but recently their Supreme Court in Dynamics said, we're going to use this reform test, this ABC test, much more likely to classify as employees. And then just September, the Assembly, the Legislative Assembly of California, adopted a bill that extends this for more employment matters and issues. It does create some exceptions, like for lawyers and doctors, but it specifically includes Uber drivers and some of the platform occupations. And also it provides for stronger enforcement. It says the Attorney General or city attorneys can sue, and it allows for workers to privately, individually sue, also as a way to avoid these compulsory arbitration agreements, which it's a little off topic, but are creating basically an inability for American workers to go to court because they have to go to their employer's arbitration provisions. So, where are we? The article I read is on this says companies are mobilizing to change this law. They're also mounting a lot of legal cases, and like all our laws, particularly, I suppose inevitably, but certainly in a common law system, the judges are going to interpret the law. I think what's most interesting, though, is in our federal system, we have both states and laws, the national government, making laws about employment issues. So as you can see, California is going one direction, and the rest of the United, or at least the national government, is going. I'm doing this wrong. California is going left, and the Trump administration and the national government is going right. And so, far right, yeah, off the table. And so, I think we're living with political division and confusion, and I think it's a question of political polarization and what happens at the next election, or maybe before an impeachment, if you pay me enough, I will tell you. I will predict the future. But actually, I won't predict the future. This is a famous baseball player in the United States, sort of a homespun philosopher who said a whole lot of really stupid things, but the more you think about it, the more they're kind of profoundly smart. And so one time, Yogi Berra said, it is very difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. So what's going to happen with all this confusion? I think, again, it may depend on the Trump administration and its future, but the future is happening right now with the Trump administration because he is appointing administrative leaders, like to the National Labor Relations Board, but even more important, federal judges that are very, very extreme and to some extent unqualified. Now I'm just blanking on the statistic, but another judicial appointment by Trump was just ruled unqualified, not less than perfectly qualified, but unqualified by our bar administration. I think it might be the fifth or sixth that he's nominated like that. So federal judges in our system are all appointed by the president. They all serve for life. We have several 80-year-olds on our Supreme Court, and they're sort of tottering on the brink. And so Trump may have a chance to shape our courts for one or two generations. They're appointing judges younger so that they can last longer. And so I think to the extent Trump is able to influence, we will see a movement to not protecting workers' rights, of course. And so that's one reason I'm a little pessimistic that the California reforms would work. The other reason I just thought I would just mention, again, this is a whole nother topic that's very big, but I think in many ways the Supreme Court is neoliberalizing our law generally. And one way they're doing it is narrowing the definition of who is an employee. So one way they're doing it is calling employees managers, and managers are not covered. They're not employees. They're part of management. And so this is a famous case where the Supreme Court did it for university professors. All of you university professors may be very surprised to hear that in the United States you would be considered managers. We don't feel much like managers either, but that's the way the Supreme Court has done it. Same thing with nurses. Nurses, which seem to be obviously employees, are often now classified as supervisors because of Supreme Court cases. And so if you think about it, in a knowledge economy where more and more employers are asking their workers to contribute ideas, this helps competition, this helps innovation. The danger is that if the employees accept that invitation and start participating in management decisions, they will be reclassified as managers or supervisors because they are making decisions and lose whatever rights they have. Okay, so I see it's after 7, so maybe I'll try to speed up a little bit. This is something I'm far from an expert in, but very interested in, and that is just sort of what's the social context? What is happening? Why is this law developing this way, and where it might go? And I'm very interested in a school of political economy called the Regulation School. It's a bunch of French economists who try to find a way between sort of the orthodox economics that think capitalism develops in a smooth, gradual pattern, and the orthodox Marxist who thinks capitalism is always on the edge of absolute collapse. And instead, they see a pattern of sort of growth and then crisis, growth and then crisis. And the term often used for that is punctuated equilibrium. And so it's a theory that produces both, or sees both continuity, namely the economy stays capitalist, but also change, because the institutional infrastructure of capitalism changes in response to these periodic crises. And so the kind of capitalism that we've had historically, at least in the United States, has varied. And so some economists at the University of Massachusetts who do a sort of analogous kind of analysis of stages of political economy in the United States have this kind of idea. You can think of it as stages or models of capitalism. So we start off with sort of individual, small-scale, competitive capitalism. Around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, we had what amounts to a corporate revolution, and the robber barons and huge corporations emerged to dominate. This produces a reaction in the 30s with the New Deal to produce more of a welfare state, and then probably in the 1970s, the welfare state, New Deal, goes into crisis, and Lord knows what we have now. But I think I'll skip this part because I think I'm talking to people who know what all this is about. Fordism as a sort of post-World War II system in the United States, mass production for mass consumption, very standardized assembly line productions. Henry Ford supposedly said, oh, the customer can choose any kind of Model T they want. You can choose any color you want as long as it's black. Very standardized, regularized, and of course, producing millions of Model Ts, somebody has to buy those Model Ts. So you get the government as a welfare state stimulating and supporting income as a way of stimulating demand. And you also have companies who are more willing to pay their workers, more willing to let their workers unionize, because that puts money in their pockets. And so Ford workers can buy Fords. And Henry Ford wants to sell Fords. Some people call that the Treaty of Detroit. Some people have said it turned out not to be a treaty, but just a truce, because this model changed. It also wasn't perfect, even though some, particularly French economists, call it the 30 golden years. There were flaws in this model. Not everybody was unionized. Blacks suffered from great discrimination. Women were second-class citizens. There are a lot of problems. But on the other hand, compared to what we've seen since the 70s, income doubled for the average American during this period, for example. So, again, I won't try to talk about why it fell apart, but it seems to have hit a crisis period in the 70s and changed, and nobody's quite sure what it changed to, or at least there's a lot of discussion. Is it neo-Fordism? Is it post-Fordism? Is it better called Toyotism? All this sort of thing. Is it globalization? I like the term global neoliberalism or just neoliberalism. A lot of people don't like that, at least in the United States. First place, it's very misleading. I'm sure you know that we use the term liberal as meaning left. And so when you say neoliberal, they say, oh, you're even more liberal than Obama. And you want to, no, that's not it. But so Bob Jessup says it's a chaotic concept. Terry Flew says that it's actually just useful as a term of derision. It's like anything I don't like, I just say it's neoliberal. So if you say, here's my proposal, and I don't like it, I say, oh, that's neoliberalism. It's just a bad word that I can throw around to brand things. But I think it's more coherent than that. So quickly, let me just say, here's some various approaches to neoliberalism. One is as a philosophy. Or you could consider it a set of policies. And this is a sort of typical list of what Thatcher did in England, what Reagan did in the United States. I think one of the more interesting ideas is David Harvey, who argues that neoliberalism is more than just a set of policies and ideas. It's a political project. And it's a political project to restore power to the capitalist class because they had lost power, and during the social movements of the 60s, many movements to correct the flaws of Fordism, civil rights movement, women's movement, environmental movement. But those movements cost money, to the companies. And so he sees a counterattack by business coming in the 1970s. I don't know if you've heard of this Lewis Powell, who became a Supreme Court justice, but he was a famous lawyer that wrote a memo to our Chamber of Commerce, our most powerful interest group, saying capitalism is losing the battle of ideas, and we need to launch a kind of counter-offensive to win things back. So businesses boosted their lobbying power. They began to give money to universities to fund think tanks. Even the creation of Fox News, I think, is like to create their own communication system without having to deal with fake news and journalism. I just point out also, well, where did I go? Interesting idea. He says this wasn't a particularly impressive economic strategy, but it was a phenomenal strategy as far as politics goes, because it redistributed wealth up from the poor to or the average to the wealthy. I highly encourage a movie by Robert Reich, and of course Piketty I see is in all the bookstores down here, etc. There are tons of statistics about how inequality has increased since the 1970s. This is one let me mention two. One, Oxford says now 8 individuals have as much wealth as the bottom half of the world population. 3 individuals, and when I started quoting that, it was 388 individuals, so it's even concentrated among the super rich. But here's my favorite. If Jeff Bezos, the president of Amazon, decided that he's got enough, of course, he's getting divorced, so maybe he's not got as much as he used to have, but he used to have $159 billion. If he's decided that's enough, I'm going to spend it all, I'm not going to accumulate anymore, he would have to spend $28 million every day to just stand still. Compare that with the average employee of Amazon who makes $28,000 a year. That's pretty phenomenal inequality. Another way to think of this would be, this is Robert Reich's idea, compare General Motors, that's the typical firm of Fordism. That's kind of ironic, isn't it? The maker of Chevrolet is the Fordist firm. But compare that to Walmart, and that's a bunch of criteria to compare, but I guess I want to direct you to look at the difference for employees. GM has got a strong union. No union at Walmart. They fought it for years. The average, these are older statistics, so it's a few years old, but the average worker at GM made $60,000 a year. Hard work on the assembly line, but decent pay. The average at Walmart is about $17,000. Where's the money going? The president of GM made 66 times the average worker. The president of Walmart makes 900 times the average worker at Walmart. Okay? I'm going to skip this, but I will recommend this. I can send you this. This is a political science, not a law article. But Hacker and Pearson analyze this. They say this is not an economic phenomenon. This is a political, it's a policy phenomenon. Those are the most followed. And they said it didn't come from policy changes as much as from what they call drift, should we say boyando. We just sort of drifted along without changing our laws while the world changed. So, for instance, our main labor law is now about 85 years old, and other than that one conservative change in 1947, it's had no significant reform. So it's ultra passado. Another way to understand neoliberalism is hegemony. Again, a concept I think you know more about than most Americans do, but the whole idea of hegemony is that ideas become so taken for granted that we just assume they're not ideas, they're just reality, they're the way things are, there's just no choice. So notice the inversion that we've suffered since the New Deal. Yes. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm sorry. So if you think about the hegemony of neoliberalism, think about the way our thinking about social problems has changed. In the New Deal and Fordist epochs, it was just assumed that the government should do something, be active in combating social and economic problems. Compare that to Ronald Reagan, who said, government isn't the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. And that just makes sense these days. Or Margaret Thatcher, after she retired, was interviewed by a journalist, and the journalist said, "What was your greatest achievement?" And she said, "Tony Blair," because even the Labor Party accepted these sort of neoliberal ideas of Margaret Thatcher as the only realistic sort of policies. So let me talk about yet another approach a little bit more. Wendy Brown is a political scientist who uses Foucault to understand neoliberalism. And she sees neoliberalism as more than an ideology or set of policies or even political project, and more everyday practices and subjectivities. It's a sort of rationality that shapes the way we think about everything we do, both publicly and in terms of our private life. So the logic and language of economics dominates not just the government, where we talk about efficiency and austerity and fiscal responsibility, but law, medicine, philanthropy, media, culture, even social change activism. We talk about social entrepreneurship, religion. We have a religion of prosperity, and Jesus wants you to be rich. And even in personal relations, we have talks by people that say, be your own brand. And so this economization of using the logic of economics shapes not only our choices, but who we are as choosing subjects. So we think of ourselves as entrepreneurs. We are entrepreneurs of ourselves because we are little mounds of human capital. So think about how we choose our jobs. Think about, for instance, our students who have to go into debt to go to college. It shapes their choices of what they study, of what sort of careers they have, because they can't study what they're interested in. They have to study what can make the most money so they can pay back their debt. So it's a kind of management. Yes, you have choices, but it's a management of your freedom by shaping the conditions of choice. So let's talk about Uber and how that might apply to Uber. Again, Uber drivers seem to be freely employed, or to tell you the truth, entrepreneurs on their own. They work on the platform, not for Uber. They are free to work when they want to, and when not, they're free from direct supervision. They choose their own vehicles, their own working hours. But this freedom is sort of an illusion because the conditions are so shaped. They are managed through automated or algorithmic managements that sets tight specifications. There's a great standardization that works against their autonomy and entrepreneurship. They can't set their rates. They can't choose their customers. They can't turn down rides. They can't cancel rides without being penalized. There are standards for their cars, and they, of course, are constantly monitored and rated by their customers. And if they don't maintain a 4.6 out of 5 rating, they are deactivated, basically fired. Nor are they really free, given the sort of state of the economy, to not work, because in this society, unless you're a capitalist, you've got to work to survive. Okay, I think I should skip on a little bit. I recommend a book called Republic of Drivers. Driving in itself is the American idea of freedom. We always free, a convertible, your hair blowing in the wind. And this guy analyzed driving, and he says, but think about how controlled you are when you're driving. First, you had to get a car. You probably had to get a loan, and you're chained to monthly payments. Then you've got to give all sorts of information to get that loan. You've got to get a license. You've got to license your car. You've got to pay taxes. Then you have to obey the rules of the road. And, of course, the main thing is you can only go where the government chooses to build roads. You don't choose. Although the ads for SUVs always show you in this great western expanse on a mountaintop, cruising through the rivers. But the reality is this. You're not free. And interestingly enough, the one choice that most Americans don't have is not to go by car, to have decent, clean, safe public transportation. But that would require a public choice that we would take together as a society to implement a public policy, not just to decide what color car we want and what make and all that sort of thing. So Wendy Brown, I'll just throw this out sort of briefly. Wendy Brown says, neoliberalism, it claims to enhance liberty, but only by a very narrow, thin, poor definition of liberty as being negative and only not being interfered. I think, incidentally, we could talk about this sometime in the future, but I think there is an implicit definition of republicanism, not meaning, the Republican Party, but an older sort of definition of freedom as not just being left alone, but not being dependent on other people, not being dominated by other people, being self-governing, that is missing from neoliberalism. And I'll give you a political example since I'm a political scientist. Wendy Brown also says this is not a democratic system to govern by neoliberalism. For example, the famous or infamous decision by our Supreme Court that corporations are people, corporations have constitutional rights, corporations spending money is a kind of speech, and therefore corporations can give any amount of money they want to, spend their money in campaigns, and have a constitutional right to do so. So it sort of enhances or views the freedom as individual rights, individual meaning corporations are individuals. But what it did is strike down a regulation of our election law, a regulation that was made collectively, publicly, deliberately by us as a society, that unlimited spending is a bad thing in our elections, and that we want votes to count for more and money to count for less. So now we're in a desperate situation, I think, in the United States, where people are able to give. One casino owner gave $120 million, or spent that much in an election. The Koch brothers spend as much on elections as the major parties, the Democratic and Republican Party. So some people are now saying, we've only had a couple of choices in the United States. You can only vote Democratic or you can vote Republican. Now, thanks to neoliberalism, we have more choice. We now have the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the Billionaires Party. So if that's your definition of democracy, fine. But again, I think it's a very weak, thin definition of democracy. So I'll leave you with this thought on this topic, at least. Fran Lebowitz said, capitalism destroyed communism in Russia, but in the United States, it's destroying democracy, or at least neoliberal capitalism. Again, okay, so now the third, and I'll be able to sort of end it. This is just a famous political scientist from Harvard. It's mostly interesting because he was a liberal Democrat. But in reaction to the social movements of the 60s, he said, you know what, we have an excess of democracy in this country. He wanted more spending on fighting communism and less spending on education and health and that sort of thing. So he said we need fewer people participating and we need fewer decisions made democratically. And he specifically said Al Smith, an old politician, was wrong. Al Smith said the cures for the ills of democracy is more democracy. And Huntington said, no, the cures for democracy is less democracy. And I guess this part of my talk is basically to argue, no, Al Smith is right, Huntington's wrong. The cure for democracy is more democracy. This is an Australian political scientist named Carol Pateman. And the basic idea is a lot of the problems of democracy, I think, come from particular types of democracy. And it turns out there's not just one thing, even though our media and it's a hegemonic idea, I think, in the United States that we only have one kind of democracy. But Carol Pateman, other authors say, oh, there are many types. And she says there's sort of two broad types. There's the pluralist democracy that basically says democracy is present if you just have a choice between elites. Like if you have a choice between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, unlike Russia, you just have only the Communist Party. Well, America's democratic because we have a choice among elites, and that's enough. But it strikes me that's a very weak definition of democracy. It's like a menu, and you're treated as a consumer. You go into a restaurant, you can order a hamburger or a cheeseburger or a veggie burger or a salad, but it's the owner who determines your choices, or at least your menu of choices. And so Pateman argued that we need the second type of democracy, a more participatory democracy, where citizens are treated as owners of the country and not merely consumers of what the elites present to them. And in particular, she argued that we need more participation where we work, because to be good citizens, we need to learn how to make decisions. And to do that, her argument is that practice makes perfect. We have to make decisions every day to make good decisions. Or if you've got children, to make people responsible, you give them more responsibility gradually. But that's her argument that, in fact, we need more participation at work because that's where most of us spend our lives at work. It's also where we're most knowledgeable about and have the most influence. I'll just recommend this as a very, very interesting book. And in fact, you can find it on the web. Just Google it. And the Tanner Lectures at Princeton. Elizabeth Anderson made a very interesting point. She said, yes, we have free labor in the U.S. You're free to sell your labor to whomever you want to. Of course, you're not free not to sell your labor unless you want to starve. But also, we're free to quit. We have at-will employment. So we have choices at the beginning of work, and we have choices at the end of work. But you don't have choices in the middle. In the middle, she says, it's a private government, and it's not a democratic government. It is hierarchical, it's authoritarian, it's undemocratic. Your boss tells you what to do, how to do it, etc. And she says it doesn't save us by saying we can choose for whom to work. It's like saying we choose our Leviathan. And it's not enough that we can leave. She says you could leave, you could immigrate from Franco's Spain if you wanted to. Did that make Franco's Spain a democracy? No. So she and Pateman argued that we need more participation democracy at work. Again, the two it's sort of a gamble, but the two big gambles or hypotheses that both of these authors would back, I think, definitely comes from Pateman. One is a development idea that people will develop the capacity to make decisions by making decisions. And in fact, that's the real argument for participation at work, not that we'll make widgets more efficiently, but we will make ourselves into more fully developed, or the word is flourishing individuals by developing our capacities. And the second hypothesis or hope is that this would then spill over to make us better citizens. The argument being that if all we do as citizens is make decisions once every 4 years at an election, and in between we're basically serfs or peons and we're told by our bosses what to do, we won't make very good decisions every 4 years. Our results could look like this, for example. So I'll basically stop here, thank God. I just want to point out, you probably know a lot of this, but there are just lots of ways that we could enhance participation, from very minor reforms, adopting things that are already happening, to fairly radical reforms. Maybe the most interesting when it comes to Uber and platform work would be co-ops. I think there are people who are actually working on trying to turn this sort of driver service into co-ops. It seems to me eminently practical. I mean, after all, taxi companies often are organized as co-ops. Why couldn't ride services be organized as co-ops? And then the problem of who's an employee would disappear, because all the drivers would be both employees and owners, and would be, I think, much more democratic in their work life. Is this practical? Is this move toward a more democratic kind of economy and work possible? Again, I just go back and point out that every so often, about every generation, we have seen crisis in our economy and radical reform or transformation, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. But it's arguable that we have been in the middle, and maybe still are in the middle after 2008, of a time of flux where we're polarized. There's no certainty. The future is open. I think the future is open for bad as well as for good. And I'll just show you this picture. This is just electoral electoral results or periods in the United States. Again, there are many theorists who argue that this is artificial, that this is imposing theory on elections that are results that are more complicated. But the idea of realignment is that we have had periods where elections are much more significant. All elections are not equal. Some elections produce a change not just of the immediate government and the immediate leadership, but they produce this change for a generation. The best example is Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, who wins not just that election, but 4 elections, and then his party continues to win elections for a generation. So it's like a seismic shock. It's an earthquake. And again, people at least think about the possibility that we are in a period where we could have a seismic shock, a move one way or the other. And so with that, I will quit. It's just a
Brilliant lecture, more of a simple talk. And yes. Well, we're open for questions, comments. So go ahead. Henrique? I think so. Otherwise, they won't be able to listen to you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I just wrote down some things. You talked about the United States, just like in 2020, we'll have something around 50% of the employees as part-time workers. There was another term you used. Yeah, contingent. Yeah. And also, we know there's not a great amount of protection for employees in the United States, and maybe not that great amount as well of social rights. So firstly, I would like to ask you how the American people feel about it. Is it something they think it's how it ought to be, or are they unsatisfied by it? And second, in Latin America and maybe in the world, we are seeing these yeah, like Chile here, we are starting to see there's gotta be another way than neoliberalism, and maybe I would like to, your input on if we are not following the path America did, what path are we walking towards to? Thank you.
Professor, thank you very much for the explanation. I would like your opinion. You mentioned that Jeff Bezos, for instance, as owner of the biggest big tech, I think, and the others, thinking about the 5 big techs, the GAFAM, GA, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they are concentrating money based on the time that people expend using social medias, and in any way, how could then deliver part of this to the society, part of this concentrate this richness, how distribute, not exactly distribute, but I think we kind of render services to them. And how can we solve this?
We're not rebelling because we're all on our cell phones.
Good evening. Good to see you again. What's your first impressions about the externalities of the Bill 5 in California? The externalities, because I've heard that because of that open too much, a lot of companies are leaving the state and or considering doing, and actually the bill target the platform economy relationship, but it doesn't in any point of the law mention platform workers. It's just a general law. It doesn't mention, and because of that, it could reach like franchise workers and a lot of workers that they're not supposed to be targeted with this law. What's your first impression about that?
So I can't say that I have closer. I can't say that I have a lot of specifics to answer about the law. In the first place, it's so new, and I'm from Georgia, not California. That's the other side of the country, and something I didn't talk about, but is worth noting. A good bit of our labor law is state law, and California is at one extreme and Georgia is at the other. So that, I mean, I've heard Georgia employment laws, lawyers say, for plaintiffs say, it is a paradise for plaintiffs, whereas Georgia, we have no laws against discrimination, against no increase in the minimum wage, etc. So I have to tell you, I just am not that familiar with the details. I'm skeptical, frankly, because I think obviously there will be some externalities. But for instance, it seems to me that one of the things we ought to be doing as a society, I speak for the United States, is internalizing some of the externalities. We, for instance, in effect, are subsidizing Walmart in the United States by letting Walmart pay so little to its employees that many of the Walmart employees are eligible for public benefits. They make so little. They're eligible for food stamps and other sort of subsidies. So we, in effect, are paying part of Walmart. So Walmart's externalities are a big issue. And the same thing, again, I'm enjoying riding on Uber here, but I feel like I, as a middle class, upper middle class, fairly affluent American, am taking advantage of somebody who must be barely able to live based on what they're charging for Uber rides. So again, that's probably true. I feel sure that there will be cost. The other aspect then is that you could say, well, that's idealistic and nice, humane, but what if businesses go elsewhere and that will hurt economic development in California? I think that's an issue. I think that's a realistic issue and one should worry about it. Again, that's part of the problem with our federal system. It encourages what is known as a race to the bottom because every state tries to lower its standards in order to attract investment and attract a business. So my state, Georgia, we've had a long run of Republican governors and before that, conservative Democrats. And so our state often rates number one in favorable business climate, but it rates near the bottom when it comes to quality of education, healthcare statistics for people. If you ask, what about the quality of life, then it's very bad. And so I think this competition among the states, it really hurts, for instance, environmental standards. So I'm not quite sure what to do about it, but it seems to me that we have to think about a certain floor and then choice within a menu that, though, protects the sort of minimum of, it's like Polanyi, you can't have an economy without understanding it's built on human beings. One last thing, again, this is very controversial, but part of what I think has happened in the last, in the neoliberal era is that capital has become mobile in a way that labor is not mobile. So that I'm sure you hear all about the barriers to immigration in the U.S., and of course that I think that's pushing Trump as much as anything. So workers can't move where they can take advantage of the best opportunities, but capital can. And so I think we need to address that kind of problem also. So maybe I come back to your problem, the question at the beginning, and I'm having trouble reading my own notes. I think, first, I think there's a lot of discontent in the United States, but it's not manifesting itself very directly. So, in other words, I think this inequality is having subtle effects on our society in ways that are often missed in the media. For instance, we have an incredibly low unemployment rate these days, and that's good. Of course, that's good. What has not happened, it's just beginning to happen. Normally, that means that wages would rise because the bargaining power of workers is enhanced because they can quit and threaten to go elsewhere and have a credible threat, and therefore the employers have to treat them. That really hasn't happened, and in fact, people are talking about, yes, quantity of employment is great, but the quality of employment is terrible. It's, again, a lot of it is insecure, low wage, Uber kind of jobs, and that's a real issue, I think. So how is that showing itself? Not riots in the street. My wife is a political scientist also, and about once a month she says, why isn't everyone rioting in the streets? And that's a good question. Maybe it's partly hegemony, for example. But, for instance, in the 2016 election, I think you can argue that both on the right and the left, there were candidates that were an expression of discontent. Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party, I am very old, and I never thought I would live to see an American presidential candidate call himself a socialist. My God, you know, that's communist, that's Russian, that's not us. And here he is, he almost toppled Hillary Clinton, who was just a given. No other Democratic candidate offered because they just knew it was settled years before that she was the candidate. And there he is, almost won. And on the right side, it's very complicated. Obviously, people say Trump represents racism and xenophobia, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I also think he represents discontent with neoliberalism. Many people are hurting economically. Many areas are hurting economically. And the 18 candidates for the Republican nomination weren't talking about that or offering anything new and just the sort of standard neoliberal policies. And Trump was different, and he argued he was going to fix it. And I think a lot of people who had voted for Obama said, let's give him a try. Let's see. I have a story that I think is very interesting, to me at least. A reporter went to a small town in Ohio that had a manufacturing plant, and that plant had closed. When the plant closed, people lost their jobs and had to get jobs at Walmart or McDonald's or other less good jobs. The tax base eroded, so the schools became really bad. The library was inadequate, et cetera, et cetera. And this reporter was talking to everybody, and he talked to a clerk at McDonald's or somewhere like that, and she said, I just want things to be the way they were. Well, what does that mean? A lot of people interpret that as meaning, I just want America to be white again. Or does it mean, I want America to work again? But either way, I think, there's a lot of discontent. One last thing is that we're not like Chile in the streets yet, but I'm reading articles, the number of strikes is rising. And there's a good deal of discontent that is not organized by traditional unions like Walmart workers. They're sort of organizing an alternative kind of organization. McDonald's workers, and you mentioned franchise workers, are organizing not exactly unions, but more kind of loose organizations to fight for the 15 to 15. So there's a good bit more worker discontent in even Uber drivers, yes. And even without protections. I mean, this is without protections, so you can be fired at any moment. And then last, to your point about, I think it's taken us a while to recognize that these amazing tech companies, Amazon and Google and Facebook, we've been so dazzled by the technology that we failed to notice that there are these huge corporations like Exxon and General Motors and this sort of thing. And so we haven't almost treated them as big, powerful entities. One thing that's sort of interesting, there's a lot of controversy about Facebook and how they've let Russian organizations spread fake news and also hate groups. And so now people are trying to say to Facebook, you should censor what goes on Facebook and control it and rule out certain kinds. Think about that a minute. We don't want the U.S. government to inhibit our speech, but do we want to turn that over to Mark Zuckerberg to decide who can speak and who can't speak? I mean, these are big, powerful organizations, and they're not organized democratically. They're organized bureaucratically, authoritarian, or at least authoritatively. And so people, for the first time, I'm seeing, not people in general, but I'm seeing think tanks in Washington begin to talk about anti-monopoly policies again. And they're going back and looking at Louis Brandeis, a famous Supreme Court justice, and Teddy Roosevelt. And it turns out that these people thought monopoly was bad, not just because they violate market freedom and competition and raise the price and lower the quality of services, but they concentrated political power. And they're arguing that we can't have these huge concentrations of economic power if we want to maintain a political democracy. It's an interesting way of thinking about it.
Any other questions? Wow. Well, I have two anxieties to share with you. But I think most recently we are facing sort of a different political phenomenon that some authors have been called far-right populism, which to a certain extent seems to undermine the stability of some democracies. Obviously, I'm talking about the North American experience, the Brazilian experience, the Hungarian experience, and some other countries that are trying to survive so hard and tough time of backlash. I never heard so many times this word backlash, and so on. And the other anxiety, this is to say, would that be something different, something qualitative, to be distinguished from the traditional meanings of the neoliberalism as an ideology? And the second anxiety is about the regulatory tools that we have to devote for platform workers, on-demand workers, gig economy workers. Beyond the discussion, the debate about classification or misclassification, even if you take for granted they are all employees, do you believe that the traditional strategies of regulating, protecting work, protecting rights and protecting workers by the traditional labor law, specifically the traditional strategies such as limiting work hours, wages, minimum wages, and stuff like that, does it work with this sort of business? I mean, you don't have the possibility to control what are the basis of algorithm and algorithm decision. They are not algorithm decisions. They are fed by political and managers' decision. So, to what extent we should think also beyond the classifying as employees or workers in the United Kingdom, but we should keep thinking of searching for different tools, different strategies for protecting workers in this scenario.
You should never answer questions from professors because they ask very hard questions, don't they? Very easy. So, on the first question on right populism, I wish I had something brilliant to say about that. The one thing I would say that's basic, and it sounds like maybe people here are more aware of it than in the United States, but there is right populism and there's left populism. And in the United States, the media just talks about populism, and many of the even intellectuals act like all populism is a threat to democracy, a threat to civil liberties. It's sort of the mad crowd that is stampeding, and And that's a lack of history, because in the United States we have a populist movement in the 1890s that was very strong, and again, it's complicated and it varied by locality, but in many places in the South where I'm from, African American farmers and white farmers cooperated to fight against and try to topple the governments of the plantation owners, and it's kind of complicated. So populism, to me, populism has this sort of, first, a differentiation, but that means that the basic populist orientation has potential to be shaped to the left or pulled to the right. And unfortunately, this is where I think a lack of alternatives has really hurt us. I mean, I think that there is a potential for left populism. So, for instance, in the United States, I think Bernie Sanders shows that you can be he calls himself a socialist, but I actually think he's more populist. He's a very weak form of socialist, if he's a socialist at all. And Elizabeth Warren, the senator from Massachusetts, who says she loves capitalism, is just almost Bernie Sanders' twin. And she doesn't have a populist style. That's the other thing, is that a lot of people define populism by style. But her proposals, I think, are very populist. And so if the American people are presented with a kind of left populism, one could hope that that might attract a lot of support as well as right populism. The trouble is, in our election system with two choices, it's hard for Democrats to talk about Obama because everybody loves Obama personally. But the Obama administration was in many ways a failure, or at least a disappointment. They bailed out the banks. They did not stimulate the economy sufficiently, so that it took years for recovery of unemployment. 10 million people lost their homes to foreclosure. And it was a huge political failure, too. I mean, the Democrats lost seats in the Congress. They lost almost 1,000 seats in the state legislatures. And, in fact, you could argue that Trump himself is a marker of how unsuccessful this Obama approach was. And Hillary is like this. One political scientist said they are neoliberal, they're progressive neoliberals. Well, I'm glad they're progressive, but they're neoliberals, you know, and they're presented, well, it's a long story, but I think there is a lot of sexism and racism that often gets mixed up with these populist votes. But again, I think that if there was a left populist leadership, that might have some potential. The other thing I should say is that it's interesting in American politics. I'm less able to speak of Germany and Spain and France, where again, or Hungary, for goodness sake, where there's real trouble with right populism. But in the United States, the movements on the left have become disorganized. This is Hacker and Pearson's article is brilliant about this. Their argument is basically, unlike Harvey's sort of a neo-Marxist, they're just traditional pluralist interest group theory, and they just say the right has become very organized. Business corporations got organized, and as a basis for votes, the religious right is providing the fuel in terms of votes. On the other hand, the left became very disorganized. Unions almost have disappeared. And so I think there needs to be some sort of progressive organization to counter the organization of the right. So that's my sort of non-answer to that. As far as different kind of tools, your question is interesting because, again, step way back, the United States has not ever had much labor law, to tell you the truth. And so that even though what little we have is being sort of lost and people are being defined out of it, in its most basic foundations, it is a negotiated model. And the National Labor Relations Law, the idea was we're just going to create this basic framework, and within that, let people negotiate. But since capital is organized in the form of big corporations, we're going to let workers organize in the form of big unions. And I love Brazil, and I love coming here, and I love studying your law, but you have a much more legislated model. And surprisingly to me, I've come to like our law better, although I appreciate your law too and think there are lots of advantages, particularly the labor court system versus our court system, which is impossible for workers to use. But in some ways, I think it's right. Why should there be one law about when everybody takes a break or how many days of vacation you have? If you had two sort of equal forces, maybe it would be better to say, okay, let's just let them get organized and then you negotiate. And some workplaces might want some sort of benefits and others might want others. But again, right now, that's a fiction. That's a utopian fiction because we don't have a balance of organization. And I guess my real utopian response would be, even that model, it seems to me, is less than the ideal. The ideal for me would be a cooperative, an economy organized principally as co-ops where everybody is a worker and everybody is an owner, and we manage our economic enterprises democratically. But that's pretty utopian, I admit.